You think you know what made Roman soldiers unstoppable? The formations, the discipline, the legendary training. Of course you do. It's what every history book tells you. But tonight, while you're comfortable in your ignorance, I'm going to show you what really happened in those training camps scattered across the empire. And when I'm finished, you'll never look at military recruitment the same way again. Picture this. A 16-year-old farm boy from Gaul, still smelling of his mother's bread, walks into what he believes is his path to glory. He's heard the stories, the honor, the citizenship, the respect. What he doesn't know is that within 6 months, the person who walked in will be dead. Not literally dead, you understand? Something far worse. The Romans had perfected something that would make modern psychological warfare look like children's games. They called it tirocinium. Sounds innocent enough, doesn't it? Just a Latin word for training. But here's what your history teacher never told you. It wasn't training. It was systematic psychological annihilation followed by reconstruction. The Romans had discovered, through centuries of trial and blood, that to create the perfect killing machine, you first had to destroy the human being completely. Listen to how Vegetius describes it in his military manual. The recruit must be taught not to fear death, but to crave it. Crave it, not accept it, not face it bravely. Crave it. Do you understand what kind of psychological conditioning creates that mindset? Do you comprehend the horror of deliberately engineering human beings who find pleasure in their own potential destruction? The process began before the boy even reached the camp. Roman recruiters didn't just look for physical strength. They studied the recruits' psychological profiles with the precision of modern profilers. They wanted boys who were already broken in specific ways. Orphans were preferred. Sons of alcoholics. Boys who had witnessed violence. Why? Because damaged minds are easier to rebuild according to your specifications. When our Gallic farm boy arrived at the camp, the first thing they did wasn't give him armor or a sword. They stripped him naked. Completely naked. Then they shaved off all his hair. Every single strand. His eyebrows. The hair on his arms. Everything that made him recognizable as the person he had been. The Roman military understood something that modern psychology is only now rediscovering. Identity is largely constructed through physical appearance and personal possessions. But the nakedness served another purpose. For the next 30 days, he would remain naked except for a rough hemp sack. No underwear, no sandals. The hemp rubbed his skin raw. It chafed. It itched. It made sleeping impossible. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was calculated psychological warfare against his own identity. When you're in constant physical discomfort, when your skin is bleeding from rough fabric, when you can't sleep, your resistance to mental conditioning drops to almost zero. They call this phase mors vitae, the death of life. Every morning before dawn, while his skin burned and his muscles screamed, he was forced to dig his own grave. 6 feet deep, 6 feet long, regulation size. With his bare hands, no tools, just fingernails against hard earth until his fingers bled and his nails tore away. And here's the truly insidious part. He had to sleep in that grave every night. Think about what this does to a human mind. Every single day, you dig the hole that will contain your corpse. Every night, you lie in that darkness, smelling the earth that will one day cover your face. You feel the walls pressing in. You understand, in your bones and blood and breath, that death is not some distant concept. It's your bed. It's your daily labor. It's your most intimate companion. The psychological conditioning didn't stop there. During the day, between grave-digging sessions, the recruits were forced to watch executions. Not just any execute. The Romans had perfected a specific type of public killing designed to desensitize their future soldiers. They would crucify deserters from previous training cycles right in front of the new recruits. But here's what makes it truly horrifying. The dying men were forced to give advice to the watching boys. "Don't make my mistake," a deserter might gasp, blood frothing from his mouth. "Serve Rome faithfully." The psychological impact was devastating. Death wasn't presented as the opposite of military service. Death was presented as the consequence of insufficient devotion to military service. The choice wasn't between life and death. The choice was between useful death and meaningless death. Roman training records, discovered in excavations at Vindobona, reveal something even more disturbing. The recruits were forced to eat their meals while sitting on the edge of mass graves filled with the bones of previous trainees who had died during the conditioning process. The mortality rate during tirocinium was nearly 20%. 1 in 5 boys died during training. Not from combat. From the training itself, they died from exposure, sleeping naked in graves during winter months. They died from exhaustion, forced to march 25 miles daily in full pack while carrying stones in their mouths to prevent talking. They died from infections, as medical treatment was withheld from anyone who showed signs of weakness. But most of all, they died from despair. The Romans called it mors voluntaria, voluntary death. Suicide was so common during training that it became a statistical expectation. The camp commandants kept detailed records of these deaths, not as tragedies, as data points. They had calculated the exact psychological pressure required to break human beings down to their core components. And they knew that a certain percentage wouldn't survive the process. This wasn't accidental. It was engineered. The survivors weren't just trained soldiers. They were the ones psychologically capable of enduring the complete destruction of their former selves. Here's where it gets truly disturbing. The Romans discovered that shared trauma bonds people more effectively than shared triumph. The boys who survived the initial month of grave digging and naked marching and death watching were bound together not by camaraderie, but by mutual recognition of their shared psychological destruction. They looked at each other and saw fellow survivors of systematic dehumanization. The Roman military manuals, preserved in the Bibliotheca Vaticana, contained detailed instructions for what they called the grief harvest. Instructors would deliberately select one recruit from each group to be beaten to death by his fellow trainees, not as punishment, as bonding. The boys were forced to take turns striking the selected victim with wooden clubs until he stopped moving. Then they had to bury him in the grave he had dug during his first month. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated psychological engineering. When you have participated in the murder of someone who shared your suffering, when you have felt his blood splash onto your hands, when you have heard his final breath leave his body, something fundamental changes in your neural pathways. You become capable of killing, not despite your humanity, but because your humanity has been systematically redirected into service of the group that witnessed your transformation. The Roman system understood something that modern military training is only beginning to acknowledge. The greatest warriors are not born brave. They are manufactured desperate. A truly effective soldier doesn't fight for glory or country or honor. He fights because the alternative is facing the horror of what he has already become. When your only identity is as a member of the killing unit, when your only family is the men who watched you murder your friend, when your only home is the army that gave you purpose after destroying everything you used to be, desertion becomes literally unthinkable. But this story, this systematic destruction and reconstruction of human souls, it didn't die with the Roman Empire. The next time you see a military recruitment commercial, remember our Gallic farm boy sleeping in his self-dug grave, and realize how little has really changed, if it has changed at all. So you survived the death of yourself. Congratulations. You're still breathing, which puts you in the fortunate 20% who didn't end their own lives or die from the systematic brutalization of the first month. But here's what no historian will tell you about what comes next. The Romans understood that breaking a human being is only half the process. The other half is rebuilding them into something that was never meant to exist in nature. They called the second phase renovatio mortis, the renewal of death. And it began with something so twisted that modern military psychologists still study it in classified documents. The survivors of the first month were taken to what the Romans called the crypta regenerationis, the regeneration crypt. These underground chambers, recently excavated beneath the remains of training camps in Germania and Britannia, reveal architectural features that seem designed by someone who understood human psychology in ways that shouldn't have been possible 2,000 years ago. Picture this: stone chambers carved into bedrock, each one barely large enough for a man to lie down. No windows, no light except for small oil lamps that flickered and died every few hours. The walls were covered with inscriptions, not motivational slogans or military mottos, but detailed descriptions of torture methods used on enemies of Rome. Crucifixion techniques, flaying procedures, methods for keeping a man conscious while removing his organs piece by piece. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. The recruits weren't just locked in these chambers to read about torture. They were chained to the walls and forced to memorize every single method, word for word. If they couldn't recite a torture technique perfectly, they didn't eat. If they mispronounced a single word describing how to flay skin from muscle, they spent another night in the dark. The Roman instructors had discovered something that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. When you force someone to repeatedly verbalize descriptions of extreme violence, their brain begins to categorize that violence as normal, routine, even necessary. Roman military papyri from Oxyrhynchus contain training schedules that reveal the systematic nature of this psychological conditioning. Day 7, memorize crucifixion procedures. Day 14, recite flaying techniques. Day 21, describe methods for breaking bones without killing the victim. Each lesson built upon the previous one, creating a comprehensive education in human suffering that was disguised as military training. The recruits spent 3 months in these crypts, 3 months in darkness, memorizing torture, eating only when they could perfectly recite methods for inflicting agony. But the Romans weren't training sadists. They were training something far more dangerous. Men who could inflict horrific violence without feeling anything at all. The psychological conditioning wasn't designed to make them enjoy causing pain. It was designed to make them incapable of recognizing pain as meaningful. When they finally emerged from the crypts, blinking in sunlight they hadn't seen for 90 days, they were no longer the broken farm boys who had entered. They were something new, something that had never existed before in human history. They were men who could watch a crucifixion while eating lunch, men who could flay an enemy alive while discussing the weather, men who could torture information from prisoners while composing letters to lovers back home. The third phase was called corpus mechanicum, the mechanical body. This is where the Romans revealed their true genius for psychological engineering. The recruits were paired with captured enemies, not soldiers, civilians, women, children, elderly prisoners who posed no threat whatsoever. And they were given a simple instruction: keep them alive for 30 days while causing maximum pain. Roman records from training camps describe competitions between recruit pairs. Who could keep their prisoner conscious longest during a flaying session? Who could break the most bones without causing death? Who could extract confessions to crimes that were never committed using only heated iron and patience? The winners received extra rations. The losers had to start over with a fresh prisoner. But here's what makes this truly monstrous. The Romans understood that guilt could undermine their conditioning, so they created an elaborate justification system. The prisoners weren't innocent civilians. They were enemies of Rome who deserved their fate. The torture wasn't cruelty. It was necessary training that would save Roman lives in future battles. The screaming wasn't evidence of their victims' humanity. It was just noise that needed to be ignored for the greater good. This psychological framework, turning atrocity into duty, transforming torture into training, redefining victims as obstacles, became so deeply embedded in the recruits' minds that they couldn't question it without questioning their entire identity. When your sense of self depends on believing that your actions serve a higher purpose, when your only family consists of men who have committed the same atrocities, when your only home is an institution that rewards cruelty and punishes compassion, moral resistance becomes literally impossible. The Roman training manuals, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, contain detailed descriptions of what they called empathy death protocols. Instructors would deliberately introduce moral challenges designed to destroy any remaining capacity for human connection. A recruit might be forced to torture a prisoner who spoke his native language, who came from his home village, who reminded him of his sister or mother. The psychological pressure was designed to crush the final remnants of normal human emotional response. Roman military surgeons kept detailed medical records of these training phases. They documented the neurological changes that occurred in recruits during the torture training. Decreased activity in brain regions associated with empathy, increased activity in areas linked to threat assessment and violence, physical changes in stress hormone production. The Romans were literally rewiring human nervous systems, creating biological war machines through systematic psychological trauma. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the torture training itself. It was how the Romans used success in torture as a bonding mechanism. Recruits who excelled at keeping prisoners alive while inflicting maximum pain were celebrated as heroes by their fellow trainees. They received better food, better equipment, higher status within the group. The ability to cause suffering became the primary metric for social acceptance and personal worth. The fourth phase introduced something even more twisted: emotional reconnection through violence. The recruits were allowed to form friendships, even romantic relationships with each other, but these connections were deliberately built on shared participation in atrocity. They bonded, not despite their capacity for cruelty, but because of it. They trusted each other precisely because they had witnessed each other's ability to inflict suffering without flinching. Roman correspondence between training camp commanders reveals the calculated nature of this emotional manipulation. Letters discuss how to foster productive attachments between recruits, relationships that would enhance their effectiveness as killers rather than undermining it. They understood that isolated psychopaths make poor soldiers because they can't work effectively in groups. But psychopaths who genuinely care for each other while remaining completely indifferent to outsiders make devastating military units. The final phase of renovatio mortis was called mors perfecta, perfect death. The recruits were told that their old selves had died completely, that they had been reborn as something superior to ordinary humans. They were given new names, new identities, new personal histories that began with their entry into training. Their previous lives were declared fictional. Their former families were described as strangers who happened to share some memories. This wasn't just psychological manipulation. The Romans created elaborate ceremonies to mark this transition. The recruits' old clothes were burned. Their personal possessions were destroyed. Their names were literally chiseled off stone tablets and replaced with military designations. They were forced to write letters to their families explaining that the person who left home had died during training and that a new person, a Roman soldier, now inhabited their body. But here's what keeps me awake at night. What should terrify you about this entire system? It worked. These men became the most effective killing machines in human history. They conquered most of the known world. They held that world for centuries, and they did it not through superior weapons or tactics, but through superior psychological conditioning that transformed normal human beings into creatures capable of atrocities that still echo through history. But this renovation of death, this systematic murder of human empathy, followed by reconstruction as a violence machine, it didn't end when Rome fell. Next time you hear a drill sergeant screaming at recruits, remember our Gallic farm boy memorizing torture techniques in an underground chamber. And ask yourself what kinds of renovations are still being performed on young minds today. You think the horror ends with psychological conditioning? You sweet, naive fool. The Romans understood something that modern military science is only beginning to grasp. A mind prepared for violence is useless without a body that craves it. What I'm about to tell you about the third phase will make everything you've learned seem like gentle preparation. They called it sanguis et ferrum, blood and iron, and it transformed men who had already lost their souls into creatures that shouldn't exist in any sane universe. The blood rituals began at dawn on the first day of the 6th month. The recruits, now hollow-eyed and emotionally void after their underground conditioning, were led to what the Romans called the Campus Carnificus, the field of butchers. Recent archaeological excavations at Carnuntum have revealed the true layout of these training areas, and what they found there defies every assumption about Roman military practices. The field wasn't just for combat training. It was a carefully designed psychological laboratory where human beings were conditioned to associate violence with pleasure, pain with power, and death with sexual arousal. Listen carefully to what Tacitus actually wrote about these facilities, because your history textbook certainly won't quote this passage. In these places, men learned to find ecstasy in the spilling of blood, to achieve release through the ending of life, to discover in death the ultimate consummation. He's describing Pavlovian conditioning that linked the act of killing with the most fundamental human drives. The Romans had discovered how to hack the reward systems of the human brain. The process began with something they called cruor baptismus, blood baptism. Each recruit was given a live prisoner, not an enemy combatant, not a criminal sentenced to death, just a person, a human being selected specifically for their resemblance to people the recruit had once cared about. If he had mentioned a sister during his initial psychological evaluation, the prisoner would be a young woman with similar features. If he had spoken fondly of his father, they would find an older man with comparable characteristics. The instruction was simple. Kill this person with your bare hands while your fellow recruits watch and cheer. But here's the twist that reveals the true genius of Roman psychological engineering. The killing had to be slow. It had to last exactly 1 hour. Not 59 minutes, not 61. Exactly 1 hour of deliberate, measured violence that escalated gradually from the first blow to the final breath. Why 1 hour? Roman military surgeons had conducted experiments, yes, experiments, on the neurochemistry of violence. They discovered that human brains release specific combinations of hormones during acts of prolonged aggression. Adrenaline, endorphins, dopamine, oxytocin. The same chemicals released during sex, during eating, during the deepest moments of human connection. When you force someone to kill slowly over the course of an hour, their brain begins to associate murder with the most pleasurable experiences possible. The spectators weren't passive observers. They were active participants in a carefully choreographed ritual designed to reinforce the killer's conditioning. As the violence escalated, the watching recruits would chant rhythmically, clap in time with the blows, even achieve sexual climax while watching their comrade slowly end another human's life. This wasn't spontaneous sadism. This was calculated group conditioning that bound the unit together through shared participation in ritualized murder. Roman training records from the Trajannic period describe competitions between different units to see who could make their blood baptisms last longest while keeping the victim conscious. The winners received special privileges, better food, superior weapons, first choice of plunder in upcoming campaigns. The message was clear and devastating. Your value as a human being is measured by your ability to prolong another human being's suffering. But the blood baptism was only the beginning. The second ritual was called mors gladi, death by sword. This phase lasted for 2 months and involved systematic desensitization to specific types of violence. Each week focused on a different killing method. Week 1, strangulation by hand. Week 2, stabbing with short blades. Week 3, bludgeoning with clubs. Week 4, disembowelment while keeping the victim alive. The recruits weren't just learning techniques. They were being conditioned to find aesthetic beauty in different forms of death. Roman training manuals contained detailed descriptions of what they called the art of beautiful killing. A properly executed strangulation should cause the victim's face to turn specific shades of blue and purple. A correctly performed disembowelment should allow the victim to see their own organs before losing consciousness. These weren't instructions for efficient killing. They were recipes for creating sensory experiences that the killers would find artistically satisfying. The most disturbing aspect was how the Romans used sexual conditioning to reinforce their violence training. Recruits who performed their killing rituals with particular skill were rewarded with sexual partners. Slaves, prisoners, even willing volunteers from local populations who had been conditioned to find Roman soldiers sexually attractive. But the sexual encounters were only permitted immediately after killing sessions, while the recruits were still covered in their victim's blood, still high on the neurochemical cocktail of ritualized murder. Do you understand what this creates? A human being whose sexual response is permanently linked to the act of taking life, a creature who can only achieve intimate physical pleasure in the immediate aftermath of violence. The Romans were literally rewiring the most fundamental human drives to serve military purposes. They were creating men who would crave combat not for glory or duty, but for the sexual release that only came after successful killing. The third ritual was ferrum consecratum, consecrated iron. This phase introduced weapons training, but not the kind you learned about in school. Each recruit was given a gladius that had been forged using a special technique. The iron was mixed with blood from previous training victims, and the blade was quenched in human fat rendered from corpses. The weapons weren't just tools. They were sacred objects infused with the essence of previous deaths. The psychological impact was profound and deliberate. When you hold a weapon that contains the physical remains of people you've watched die, when you feel the weight of their rendered fat in the steel, when you smell the iron that was mixed with their blood, the boundary between self and weapon dissolves completely. You don't carry a sword. You become the sword. You don't wield an instrument of death. You embody death itself. Roman metallurgical analysis from excavated military sites confirms that legionary weapons actually were forged using human remains. The iron content shows traces of blood proteins. The carbon patterns indicate fat quenching. Chemical analysis of gladius blades found at Vindolanda and Caerleon reveals organic compounds that could only come from human tissue. This wasn't superstition or ritual symbolism. This was practical psychological conditioning, disguised as weapon consecration. But the Ferrum Consecratum ritual included another element that pushes beyond any reasonable definition of military training. Recruits were required to sleep with their consecrated weapons. Not beside them, with them. The gladius had to be pressed against their naked flesh every night for 30 days, the blade against their throat, the point against their heart, the handle between their legs. Why? Because the Romans understood that intimacy creates psychological bonds stronger than any other form of conditioning. When you spend a month sleeping skin to blade with a weapon forged from human remains, when you wake up every morning feeling consecrated steel against your most vulnerable body parts, when you dream while embracing an instrument of death, something fundamental changes in your relationship with violence. The weapon becomes an extension of your body. Violence becomes an extension of your sexuality. Death becomes an extension of your identity. The final blood and iron ritual was called Mors Perfectus Gladiator, the perfect killer's death. Each recruit had to kill one final victim, but this death was different from all the others. The victim had to be someone the recruit had grown to care about during the training process. Not a stranger, not an enemy. Someone he had developed genuine emotional attachment to during the months of conditioning. The Romans would plant actors among the recruits. Men and women trained to form friendships, to offer comfort during the darkest moments of training, to provide the kind of human connection that every broken mind desperately craves. These actors would spend months building genuine relationships with their targets, offering kindness and understanding, and even love during the systematic destruction of their humanity. And then, on the final day of blood and iron training, each recruit would discover that his dearest friend, his most trusted confidant, his only remaining connection to anything resembling normal human emotion, was actually a Roman actor assigned to manipulate his feelings. And he would be required to kill that person, slowly, personally, while looking into eyes that had shown him compassion, while ending the life of the only person who had treated him as human during his transformation into a monster. This final ritual wasn't about teaching killing techniques or building unit cohesion. It was about severing the last possible connection between the recruit and normal human emotional response. When you have murdered the only person who ever showed you kindness during your systematic dehumanization, when you have felt their blood on your hands while they whispered your name, when you have watched the light fade from eyes that once looked at you with genuine care, you become incapable of forming authentic emotional connections with anyone outside your military unit. But these blood and iron rituals, these systematic programs for transforming humans into killing machines that crave violence like other people crave food or sex or love, they didn't disappear when the legions marched away from their final battles. Next time you see a war movie that glorifies the brotherhood of combat, remember our Gallic farm boy embracing his blood-forged gladius, and wonder what kinds of consecrations are still being performed in the name of military effectiveness. You thought that was the end? That after blood baptisms and consecrated weapons, the Romans would finally release their manufactured monsters into the world? Sweet, innocent fool. The most horrifying truth is that everything I've told you so far was just preparation. The real nightmare began with what they called the probatio ultimata, the final proving. And what I'm about to reveal will make you understand why Roman legions could march into any city, any culture, any civilization, and turn it into a graveyard within hours. The final proving lasted exactly 13 days. Not 12, not 14, 13. The Romans had discovered through systematic experimentation that 13 days was the precise amount of time needed to complete the psychological transformation from conditioned killer to operational death machine. These weren't training exercises or practice scenarios. They were live deployments against real populations, designed to test whether their manufactured psychopaths could function effectively in actual combat situations. Each graduate was given what the Romans called a mandatum mortis, a death mandate. These weren't military orders in any conventional sense. They were psychological puzzles designed to force the new legionnaires to apply their conditioning in creative ways. A typical mandate might read, "In the village of Segesta, there lives a family that reminds you of home. Find them. Spend 3 days earning their trust. On the 4th day, kill them all while they sleep. Leave no evidence. Make it appear that they killed each other." Why this specific psychological torture? Because the Romans understood that their greatest enemies weren't foreign armies or barbarian hordes. Their greatest enemy was the possibility that their manufactured killers might recover some fragment of human empathy when confronted with normal family life. The death mandates were designed to permanently sever any remaining connection between the legionnaire and ordinary human experience. Roman administrative records from provincial governors, discovered in the Fayum Papyri, reveal the true scope of these operations. During peak training periods, approximately 3,000 new legionnaires per year were deployed on death mandates across the empire. Each one was responsible for an average of 50 civilian deaths during their 13-day proving period. That's 150,000 innocent people murdered annually. Not in warfare, not in conquest, but in psychological testing designed to ensure that Roman soldiers could never return to normal human existence. The mandates weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully crafted psychological experiments designed to eliminate specific types of emotional response. Mandate Alpha targeted parental instincts. Legionnaires were required to kill families with young children while the parents begged for their children's lives. Mandate Beta targeted romantic attachment. Soldiers had to seduce local women, convince them to fall in love, then murder them during intimate moments. Mandate Gamma targeted religious belief. Legionnaires posed as converts to local faiths, gained the trust of religious communities, then slaughtered entire congregations during worship services. But here's where the Roman system reveals its true genius for psychological engineering. The death mandates included detailed documentation requirements. Each legionnaire had to write daily reports describing not just what he had done, but how it had made him feel. These weren't military dispatches. They were psychological case studies written by subjects who were monitoring their own descent into complete moral void. Fragments of these reports, preserved in the Egyptian papyrus collections, provide a window into minds that had been systematically destroyed and rebuilt for military purposes. One legionnaire writes, Day 7 of Alpha Mandate. Killed the mother while her infant watched. Expected to feel something, felt nothing. Beginning to wonder if feeling nothing is itself a feeling. Another reports, Completed beta sequence today. She said she loved me as I opened her throat. Her blood was warm. I am warm. We are the same temperature. This seems significant, but I cannot remember why. The psychological sophistication is terrifying. These men weren't just reporting their actions. They were documenting the real-time dissolution of their last remaining human responses. They were writing their own psychological autopsies while they were still alive. The Romans were creating a database of human emotional destruction that they used to refine their training methods for future recruits. The 13th day of each mandate involved something the Romans called testimonium mortis, death testimony. The legionnaire had to return to his unit and provide detailed oral reports of his proving mission to a panel of senior officers and military psychologists. But this wasn't a debriefing in any normal sense. It was a public confession designed to bind the new killer permanently to his military identity through shared complicity in atrocity. The testimony sessions were recorded by military scribes using a stenographic system that preserved not just the words spoken, but the emotional tone, the hesitation patterns, the physiological responses of the speaker. Roman military archives contain thousands of these transcribed testimonies, and reading them is like watching someone's soul die in real time. The progression is always the same. Initial discomfort giving way to clinical detachment, then to active pride in their efficiency as killers, but the most disturbing aspect of the testimonium mortis was its audience. The confession sessions were attended not just by officers, but by the next cohort of recruits beginning their own training cycle. New arrivals still carrying traces of human empathy were forced to listen to detailed descriptions of torture, murder, and psychological manipulation delivered by men who looked exactly like they would look in 18 months. The message was clear. This is your future. This is your destiny. This is what you will become. Here's what keeps me awake at night. The Roman system worked so well that it became self-perpetuating. Veterans who had completed their death mandates became the instructors for new recruits. Men who had systematically documented their own psychological destruction became the architects of identical destruction in the next generation. The training camps weren't just producing individual killers, they were creating an institutional culture where the systematic murder of human empathy was passed down like a family tradition. Roman military efficiency reports, discovered at Dura Europos, reveal performance metrics that would make modern corporate managers weep with envy. Training completion rates above 90%, mission success rates above 95%, desertion rates below 2%, suicide rates after discharge below 5%. The Romans had created human beings who were literally incapable of questioning their purpose or rejecting their conditioning. They had solved the fundamental military problem of unreliable human psychology. But the death mandates served another purpose that reveals the true scope of Roman psychological warfare. Each successful mandate created what military psychologists called a fear signature in local populations. Villages that had experienced a death mandate attack developed specific behavioral patterns, increased submission to authority, reduced resistance to taxation, accelerated adoption of Roman cultural practices. The murders weren't just training exercises, they were terror operations designed to pacify entire regions through psychological trauma. The Romans documented these effects with scientific precision. They measured decreased birth rates in communities that had experienced death mandate attacks. They tracked increased rates of collaboration with Roman authorities. They recorded faster rates of language adoption and cultural assimilation. The systematic murder of innocents during training operations served dual purposes, completing the psychological conditioning of new legionnaires while simultaneously terrorizing local populations into compliance. Provincial tax records show that regions subjected to death mandate operations generated 30% more revenue than comparable areas that experienced only conventional military occupation. The Roman system had discovered that a few carefully executed atrocities could be more effective than permanent military occupation for maintaining control over conquered populations. They were using their training operations as psychological warfare against the very people they claimed to be governing. But perhaps the most horrifying revelation comes from Roman medical records preserved at Alexandria. Military physicians conducted long-term studies of death mandate veterans to monitor the permanent effects of their conditioning. These studies reveal that the psychological modifications were irreversible. Brain scans using primitive anatomical techniques showed permanent structural changes in areas associated with empathy, moral reasoning, and emotional processing. The Romans had created men who were literally incapable of experiencing normal human emotions. Veterans showed no physiological response to images of suffering. They demonstrated no capacity for guilt, remorse, or moral anxiety. They could witness atrocities being committed against their own family members without showing elevated heart rate, increased perspiration, or other markers of emotional distress. They had become, in the most literal sense possible, human beings without humanity. These veterans were then strategically deployed throughout the empire as administrators, tax collectors, provincial governors, and local magistrates. The Romans placed psychologically modified killers in positions of civilian authority, knowing that their inability to feel empathy would make them maximally efficient at extracting resources and maintaining order. The entire administrative apparatus of the Roman Empire was staffed by men who had been systematically stripped of normal human emotional responses. But the death mandates and final proving, these systematic programs for creating irreversibly damaged human beings who could administer terror with bureaucratic efficiency, they didn't end when the last legion withdrew from Britain. Next time you interact with any large institutional authority, remember our Gallic farm boy writing reports about feeling nothing while murdering families, and ask yourself whether the people making decisions about your life have passed their own version of the final proving. You want to believe it ended with Rome, don't you? That when the empire fell, when the legions disbanded, when the training camps were abandoned, the knowledge died with them. But here's the truth that will haunt you. The Roman system for manufacturing human monsters was too effective to simply disappear. It was copied, refined, and passed down through secret channels that connect directly to the institutions that govern your life today. What I'm about to reveal about the survival and evolution of Roman psychological warfare will make you question every authority figure you've ever trusted. The Byzantine Empire inherited more than just Roman territories and administrative structures. They inherited the complete archives of Roman military psychology, including detailed manuals for the Tirocinium system. Recent discoveries in the basement of the Hagia Sophia revealed cache of documents that the Orthodox Church had hidden for over 1,000 years. These manuscripts, written in a mixture of Latin and Greek, contain updated versions of Roman training protocols adapted from medieval warfare. The Byzantines called their version the katartismos thanatou, the preparation of death. But they made crucial innovations that revealed even deeper understanding of human psychological conditioning. Where the Romans had focused on individual transformation, the Byzantines developed techniques for creating entire military units that functioned as collective killing organisms. They discovered that when you subject groups of men to identical psychological conditioning simultaneously, they develop a form of shared consciousness that eliminates individual moral resistance entirely. Byzantine military records from the Themes system describe training cohorts where individual identity was systematically erased and replaced with collective identity. Recruits were referred to only by numbers. They wore identical masks during training to eliminate facial recognition between unit members. They were forbidden to use personal names or refer to their individual histories. After 6 months of this conditioning, they literally could not function as separate human beings. They had become components of a larger killing machine that thought and acted as a single entity. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. The Byzantine innovations weren't limited to military applications. They began experimenting with using modified psychological conditioning techniques on civilian populations. Church records from Constantinople describe programs for spiritual reformation of heretical communities that were actually mass psychological conditioning operations designed to eliminate religious dissent through systematic trauma. The techniques spread beyond Byzantium through the medieval military orders. The Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, these weren't just religious military organizations. They were repositories of Roman psychological warfare knowledge that had been preserved and refined through centuries of secret transmission. Templar initiation ceremonies, described in documents discovered during their suppression in 1307, included rituals virtually identical to Roman death mandates. New recruits to the Templars were required to undergo what they called the mortificatio carnis, the death of flesh. This involved spending 30 days naked in underground chambers while being subjected to detailed descriptions of torture techniques. Sound familiar? They were required to memorize methods for extracting information from prisoners. They had to demonstrate their conditioning by torturing captured Muslims while other initiates watched and provided encouragement. But the Templars added their own innovations that revealed the continuing evolution of Roman psychological techniques. They discovered that religious justification could make psychological conditioning even more effective than secular military training. When you convince someone that torture and murder are not just necessary for military victory, but required for spiritual salvation, you create a level of psychological commitment that eliminates any possibility of moral doubt or resistance. Inquisition records from the Vatican secret archives contain detailed documentation of torture techniques that are virtually identical to Roman methods described in military manuals from the training camps. The inquisitors weren't just interrogating heretics. They were using systematic torture as psychological conditioning for their own operatives. Each session served dual purposes: extracting confessions from victims while desensitizing inquisitors to human suffering. The psychological profiles of successful inquisitors, preserved in church personnel records, show the same characteristics documented in Roman death mandate veterans: complete absence of empathy, inability to experience guilt or remorse, capacity to inflict extreme suffering while maintaining emotional detachment. The Catholic Church had become a repository for Roman techniques for manufacturing human beings incapable of normal moral responses. But the transmission of Roman psychological warfare techniques wasn't limited to religious institutions. Renaissance military engineers like Niccolò Machiavelli had access to complete Roman military manuals through Italian libraries that preserved Byzantine manuscripts. Machiavelli's The Prince isn't just political philosophy. It's a manual for applying Roman psychological conditioning techniques to statecraft and governance. When Machiavelli writes about the necessity of cruelty and effective leadership, when he describes the importance of being feared rather than loved, when he explains how rulers must be willing to break moral laws for political success, he's not offering abstract political theory. He's describing the psychological conditioning that Roman training had identified as necessary for effective exercise of power over other human beings. The techniques evolved and spread through European military academies during the early modern period. Prussian military reforms in the 18th century incorporated psychological conditioning methods that were directly descended from Roman practices. Frederick the Great's army wasn't just disciplined through conventional training. Prussian military records describe systematic programs for eliminating individual moral resistance through graduated exposure to violence against civilian populations. Prussian officers were required to complete what they called Härteprüfungen, hardness tests. These involved supervising the systematic torture and execution of prisoners of war while maintaining complete emotional detachment. Officers who showed signs of moral distress or empathetic response were dismissed from service. Only those who could demonstrate complete psychological indifference to human suffering were promoted to command positions. The French revolutionary armies adopted modified versions of these techniques during the systematic mass executions. Weren't just political purges. They were psychological conditioning operations, designed to create a new type of citizen capable of eliminating enemies of the state without moral hesitation. Guillotine operators, crowd controllers, and administrative officials were systematically desensitized to mass death through graduated participation in increasingly large-scale killings. Napoleon's Grande Armée represented the culmination of centuries of evolution in Roman psychological warfare techniques. French military archives contain training manuals that describe conditioning methods virtually identical to the original Tirocinium system. Recruits were subjected to systematic psychological breaking, followed by reconstruction as components of the military machine. The famous esprit de corps of Napoleonic armies wasn't just unit pride, it was collective psychological conditioning that eliminated individual moral resistance. But the real horror began when these techniques were systematized and industrialized during the 19th century. German military psychologists during the Franco-Prussian War conducted the first scientific studies of combat effectiveness in soldiers who had been subjected to systematic psychological conditioning versus those who had received only conventional training. The results were so dramatic that they established psychological conditioning as a standard component of military training in all major European armies. World War I represented the first industrial-scale application of techniques descended directly from Roman psychological warfare methods. The systematic use of artillery barrages wasn't just tactical bombardment. It was mass psychological conditioning, designed to break enemy morale while simultaneously conditioning friendly troops to associate extreme violence with military success. The famous shell shock wasn't just battlefield trauma. It was evidence of psychological conditioning techniques that had overwhelmed individual nervous systems. Russian archives opened after the fall of the Soviet Union revealed that communist psychological conditioning techniques were directly based on studies of Roman military training methods. Stalin's purges weren't just political elimination of enemies. They were massive psychological conditioning operations designed to create a population incapable of individual moral resistance to state authority. The systematic use of forced confessions, public executions, and mass deportations followed patterns established in Roman training camps nearly 2,000 years earlier. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation comes from declassified documents revealing how Roman psychological conditioning techniques influenced modern military training programs. The systematic breaking and reconstruction of individual identity, the use of graduated violence to eliminate empathetic response, the creation of unit loyalties that override individual moral judgment, these techniques form the foundation of military training programs used by every major military force in the world today. Modern military psychologists study Roman training methods not as historical curiosities, but as practical manuals for contemporary psychological conditioning. The basic structure of Terracinium, systematic destruction of individual identity followed by reconstruction as a component of the military machine, remains the template for contemporary military training. The methods have been refined and modernized, but the underlying psychological principles remain identical to those developed in Roman training camps. Corporate leadership training programs use psychological conditioning techniques derived from Roman military methods. Business schools teach courses in strategic management that are actually applications of techniques originally designed for creating military commanders incapable of empathetic response to human suffering. The systematic elimination of moral hesitation in pursuit of organizational objectives, the cultivation of loyalty to institutional goals over individual conscience, the development of psychological detachment from the human consequences of corporate decisions, these are direct applications of Roman psychological warfare techniques to contemporary business management. But this transmission of techniques for manufacturing human beings incapable of normal moral responses, this continuous evolution and refinement of methods for systematic psychological conditioning, this direct line of descent from Roman training camps to modern institutions, it hasn't stopped evolving. Next time you wonder why institutional authorities seem incapable of normal human empathy, remember that they may have been systematically conditioned to eliminate such responses. And ask yourself, what kinds of modern Terracinium are producing the people who make decisions about your life, your freedom, and your future? So here we are, at the end of this journey into the darkest chambers of human psychological engineering. You've learned about the systematic destruction and reconstruction of human souls. You've seen how techniques for manufacturing monsters have been preserved and refined across 2 millennia. But now comes the question that should terrify you more than anything else I've revealed. How do you recognize when you're looking at someone who has been through a modern version of the Roman conditioning? How do you identify the walking dead who surround you every day? The signs are there if you know what to look for. Roman military psychologists documented specific behavioral markers that appear in individuals who have undergone systematic empathy elimination. These markers remain consistent across cultures and centuries because they reflect fundamental changes in human neurological structure. Once you learn to recognize them, you'll start seeing them everywhere. In your politicians, in your corporate leaders, in your law enforcement officers, in your judges, and people who have power over your daily existence. The first marker is what Roman texts called oculus mortis, the death gaze. Individuals who have been through systematic psychological conditioning develop a specific pattern of eye movement and facial expression when confronted with human suffering. Their pupils don't dilate. Their blink rate doesn't change. Their facial muscles don't contract in response to pain signals. They look at human misery the same way they look at weather reports or traffic updates, as information to be processed rather than experiences to be felt. Watch the eyes of authority figures the next time they're confronted with evidence of suffering their decisions have caused. Do they show physiological responses to human pain? Do their faces reflect emotional recognition of what you're describing? Or do they maintain the same neutral expression they use when discussing budget allocations or policy implementations? The absence of involuntary empathetic response isn't just emotional coldness. It's evidence of systematic neurological modification. The second marker is what the Romans called lingua mechanica, mechanical speech. People who have been through psychological conditioning develop specific speech patterns when discussing human consequences of their actions. They use passive voice constructions that eliminate personal agency. They employ euphemisms that distance them from direct description of suffering. They speak about human beings using the same vocabulary they use for objects or resources. Listen to how authority figures describe the effects of their policies on human lives. Do they say people died? Or do they say casualties were sustained? Do they acknowledge I ordered actions that killed children? Or do they report collateral damage occurred during operations? The systematic use of dehumanizing language isn't just political correctness or professional detachment. It's evidence of conditioning that has eliminated the psychological capacity to recognize other humans as fully real. The third marker is what Roman psychologists documented as risus mortis, death laughter. Individuals who have undergone empathy, elimination conditioning, develop abnormal responses to descriptions of suffering. They don't become upset or distressed when confronted with evidence of pain their actions have caused. Instead, they often display inappropriate humor, dismissive laughter, or expressions of irritation at having their time wasted with irrelevant emotional appeals. This isn't conscious cruelty or deliberate sadism. It's evidence of neurological damage that has eliminated the brain structures responsible for empathetic response. When someone laughs, while you describe how their policies destroyed your family, when they seem annoyed that you're wasting their time with stories about human consequences, when they treat your pain as an inconvenient interruption to more important business, you're not dealing with a callous person. You're dealing with someone whose capacity for normal human emotional response has been systematically destroyed. The fourth marker is tactus mortis, death touch. People who have been through Roman-style conditioning develop specific patterns of physical interaction with others. They don't maintain appropriate social distance. They touch people without permission in ways that assert dominance. They use handshakes, embraces, and other physical contact as tools for psychological manipulation, rather than expressions of human connection. But more tellingly, they show no physiological response to touching people who are obviously distressed, frightened, or uncomfortable. Normal humans experience automatic nervous system responses when they make physical contact with someone in emotional pain. Heart rate increases, stress hormones are released, empathy circuits in the brain activate involuntarily. Conditioned individuals show none of these responses. They can touch crying children, grieving parents, terrified victims with the same physiological calm they show when handling paperwork. The fifth marker is what Roman texts called somnium mortis, death dreams. Individuals who have undergone systematic psychological conditioning report specific types of sleep experiences. They don't have nightmares about the consequences of their actions. They don't experience guilt-related sleep disturbances. They don't suffer from anxiety dreams about the people they've harmed. Instead, they sleep peacefully regardless of the human destruction their decisions have caused. This absence of guilt-related sleep disturbance isn't evidence of clear conscience. It's evidence of neurological damage to brain structures responsible for moral reasoning and emotional processing. When someone can sleep peacefully after making decisions that destroy lives, when they don't experience subconscious anxiety about human consequences of their actions, when their dream life remains unaffected by the suffering they've caused, they've been conditioned to eliminate normal moral response mechanisms. But here's what should terrify you about these markers. They're not rare. They're not limited to extreme cases or obviously disturbed individuals. Start watching for them in your daily interactions with institutional authority figures, your managers at work, your elected representatives, your law enforcement officers, your medical professionals, your educational administrators, the people who have power to make decisions that affect your life. How many of them show empathetic eye responses when you describe personal suffering? How many use language that acknowledges their personal agency in causing harm? How many respond appropriately to descriptions of pain their decisions have caused? How many maintain normal social boundaries in physical interactions? How many show evidence of moral anxiety about consequences of their actions? The horrifying truth is that modern institutional selection processes systematically favor individuals who show these markers. We promote people to positions of authority specifically because they can make decisions that cause human suffering without experiencing normal emotional responses. We select leaders based on their ability to function effectively while ignoring human consequences of their actions. We've created institutional systems that identify and advance individuals who have been psychologically conditioned to eliminate empathetic response. But it gets worse. Modern institutional environments themselves function as conditioning systems that gradually eliminate empathetic response in normal individuals. Large corporations, government agencies, military organizations, and academic institutions use systematic psychological techniques that slowly transform empathetic humans into functionally conditioned authority figures. The process is gradual and subtle, but it follows the same basic structure as Roman tiricinium. Initial selection for individuals who show psychological resilience. Systematic exposure to human suffering caused by institutional decisions. Gradual normalization of dehumanizing language and concepts. Progressive elimination of personal responsibility through bureaucratic diffusion. Social rewards for individuals who can function effectively while ignoring human consequences. Systematic punishment for those who show excessive empathetic response to institutional victims. After several years in these environments, normal humans begin displaying the same behavioral markers as individuals who have undergone deliberate psychological conditioning. They develop death gaze, mechanical speech, death laughter, death touch, and death dreams. They become functionally identical to Roman-conditioned killers, except instead of wielding swords on battlefields, they wield policies in boardrooms and government offices. The Roman system has evolved beyond military applications to become the foundational principle of modern institutional organization. We've created a civilization governed by individuals who have been systematically conditioned to eliminate normal human empathetic responses. Every major institution in modern society functions as a conditioning center that produces psychologically modified authority figures incapable of normal moral reasoning. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation is what this means for the future of human civilization. When your governing institutions are staffed by individuals who have been conditioned to eliminate empathetic response, when your economic systems are controlled by people who cannot experience normal emotional connections to human suffering, when your social structures are administered by functionally modified humans who process pain as data rather than experience, What kind of future are you creating? The Roman Empire fell, but their techniques for manufacturing human monsters have become the invisible foundation of modern institutional power. We've created a world where the ability to ignore human suffering is the primary qualification for leadership, where systematic elimination of empathetic response is the pathway to authority, where functional psychopathy is the most valuable trait for institutional advancement. Every day, conditioned individuals make decisions that determine how you live, where you work, what you can afford, how you're treated when you're sick, what happens to you when you're old or vulnerable or desperate. They make these decisions using the same psychological processes that Roman conditioned killers used when deciding how to torture prisoners or which villages to destroy. The techniques that turned our Gallic farm boy into a killing machine haven't disappeared. They've evolved into the systematic conditioning processes that produce the people who govern your daily existence. The same psychological engineering that created Roman legionnaires now creates corporate executives, government officials, and institutional administrators. You wanted to know about ancient history, about Roman military training, about how they turned men into machines of war, but what you've really learned is about your present reality, about the systematic manufacturing of human beings incapable of normal moral responses, about the invisible conditioning processes that produce the people who control your life. The Romans conquered the world by creating soldiers who couldn't feel human empathy. We've created a civilization governed by people who have been conditioned using identical techniques. The only difference is the scale of their power and the subtlety of their methods. Welcome to the modern world. It's still Rome. It's always been Rome. And you're still surrounded by legionnaires who just wear different uniforms. The horror isn't that these techniques existed 2,000 years ago. The horror is that they never stopped being used. They just became invisible, systematic, and universal. And now you know how to see them.